عليكم ورحمة الله. أهلا بكل الحاضرين في هذه الندوة وبكل من تسجل. المسجلين معنا اليوم 986 شخص، الحاضرين معنا إلى حد الآن 194، بشوف الآن 198. أرحب باسمكم جميعا بكل المتحدثين. اليوم معنا مجموعة من المتخصصين والذين سيتحدثون. أهلا وسهلا بالدكتور روبرت ميروود، الرئيس التنفيذي المسؤول عن الأبحاث في مؤسسة RMS. الدكتور لوران ماريسكو، وهو مدير أول مسؤول عن المنتجات لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط وآسيا. ومن العالم العربي عندنا الأستاذ عبد الرحيم الشافعي، مدير صندوق الكوارث الطبيعية من المغرب، والأستاذ أحمد القريشي، رئيس الأكتواريين في الإعادة السعودية. ولإدارة الندوة معي أندري إيسل، وهو المدير المسؤول عن المبيعات في مؤسسة RMS. من مؤسسة RMS معنا كذلك الأستاذ فيفيك بجاج، وهو مانجينج دايركتور أو العضو المنتدب. سيلقي كلمة بسيطة للتحدث عن RMS بعد قليل. ما هي مؤسسة RMS والتي ترعى مشكورة هذه الندوة؟ RMS هي مؤسسة تعمل في مجال المخاطر، وهي رائدة في هندسة وتوفير نماذج للكوارث الطبيعية موديلينج، وجعلها في متناول شركات التأمين وإعادة التأمين. هذه البرامج سوفتوير تساعد كل المؤسسات المالية على الإدراك والفهم المبكر لمخاطر الكوارث والمخاطر التي من صنع الإنسان. باسم الاتحاد العام العربي للتأمين أشكر RMS على رعايتها لهذه الندوة وتشجيعها. أشكر كل المتحدثين كل واحد باسمه، وأنا أقدر المجهود والوقت الذي يخصصونه لهذه الندوة. بالتعاون مع RMS نحاول في الاتحاد العام العربي للتأمين التوعية بأهمية دراسة الكوارث الطبيعية قبل حصولها، وإيجاد حلول على شكل نماذج لأجل استباقها. إذا كان لا يمكننا التنبؤ بالكوارث، فإن واجبنا كمجتمعات وحكومات وأفراد الاستعداد لها. نشكر كل المتحدثين لمساهمتهم ولمؤسسة دعم، ونشكر مؤسسة RMS لدعمها، ونشكر الحاضرين والمتابعين لنشاط الاتحاد العام العربي للتأمين. الآن سأتكلم بعجالة لإعطاء بعض الأرقام، ولكن اعذروني سأتكلم بالإنجليزية فقط الآن. As per Mercury in 2020, the nat-cat losses amounted $200 billion. As per Swiss Re, natural catastrophe and climate change man-made disaster globally amounted 83 billion in 2020, while the economic losses reached 214 billion. For the MENA region, we have seen the biotic explosion in 2020, which is the worst event we have experienced in modern history. Cities like Alexandria or Casablanca may face potential cumulative losses of $1 billion as per the World Bank due to the climate change. The climate change might cause decrease in GDP for countries like Tunisia or Yemen, 6.8% for Tunisia and 23.9% for Yemen. This is huge. Protection gap issues. Only 36% of the economic losses were covered by insurance. And as you can see, the insurance gap all over the world is 64%, which is huge. In 2020, the protection gap is becoming more obvious, especially in our developing countries. However, we have many initiatives in the Arab world. In Algeria, the CCR is leading a cat pool. In Morocco, we have the nat-cat fund, and my friend and colleague Abdurrahim Shafi will speak about it. And we have also in Morocco the insurance company scheme, which is managed by CAT. In Tunisia, there is a new natural disaster damage catastrophe fund, FIDEC, and the World Bank and Agence Française de Développement are providing $100 million to finance a project to strengthen and enhance disaster and climate resilience. The project will support a joint effort between the public sector and the insurance companies. In Oman, the CMA, the Capital Market Authority, is considering the establishment of a disaster insurance fund. Before giving the floor to my colleague Andre, Mr. Vivek Bajaj is asked to speak to introduce RMS. Please, Mr. Vivek.
Shukran, Shakib. Thank you very much for your kind words. And also, we are delighted to be partnering with GAIF for this webinar. We are also very, very delighted with actually the number of attendees that have registered for this webinar. I think it underlines very much how actual the theme of both natural catastrophe modeling as well as dealing with man-made disasters is becoming in our market and our industry. For those of you who don't know RMS, Risk Management Solutions, we have been in the business of nat-cat modeling for several decades. And in fact, we work very actively with most large insurers and reinsurers in this space for several years. Our approach is generally less of being a vendor to these companies, but more of being a partner where we co-create and actually develop for our market and for our industry new offerings and continue to innovate over time. Obviously, in the areas of natural catastrophes, we continue to cover all the key perils of relevance all over the world, but also in the area of man-made catastrophes, whether it has to do with terrorism or cyber risk, we continue to make significant investments in order to cover these perils as well. We're also delighted to continue to develop our presence in the MENA region. You will hear about some of our initiatives from my colleagues at RMS, from Robert Muir Wood, who is our Chief Research Officer, but also a celebrated author and commentator for the industry for many, many years. I'm sure you will find that very engaging. And following that, you will also have a discussion with Laurent Moresco, who is one of our chief experts in this area as well. And then obviously we look forward to hear from Mr. Shafai around their initiatives for the Moroccan Solidarity Fund as well. The one thing that I would like to add is following that you will also hear from Mr. Al-Qareshi from Saudi Re. I'm delighted to let you know that after a long evaluation over several months now, we have finally decided, or Saudi Re has decided, to partner actively with RMS in a partnership going forward. We are delighted with this vote of confidence and delighted to hear them speak at this event as well. Let me now take the opportunity to hand over to my colleague Andre Eisel, who is on my team and responsible specifically for the MENA region, who will, together with the Shakib, manage the facilitation for this event. So, Andre, let me hand over to you at this stage, please.
Well, thank you very much, Vivek. I believe you can all hear me loud and clear. Let me just once again say thank you to everybody who's on the phone here today or on this particular Zoom call for taking time. We all have a lot of virtual calls at the moment, but we do believe that what the GAIF and RMS have joined up with for this particular event is something very interesting, something very relevant, and I'm thrilled to be back on the stage with so many great speakers. Shakib and I are basically your hosts or the moderators for today's event, so we're going to try to keep it lively. And I want to quickly introduce Shakib himself because he is, at the end of the day, the person who made this event actually happen. This is basically his biography, as you can see here. For those of you who don't know him, I've had the pleasure of dealing with Shakib now for the last several months. He is the Secretary General of the General Arab Insurance Federation. So a very powerful federation that I haven't seen in many places of the world, where you can actually connect all the different countries in the MENA region under one different umbrella. It's very powerful and it's fantastic. You can more or less see on this particular slide the different roles that Shakib has had in the industry. And I'm not going to read it out. I'm not going to mention the different types of very high-level professional roles he's had, the different types of academia and certificates that he's acquired throughout his career. What I will say is, in all my years in reinsurance, I've met very few people that are as passionate about the business as the region as Shakib is. And I think you should all be thrilled to have someone like him leading the GAIF. And Shakib, pleasure to be working with you on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You can continue with the presentation with the biography, please. Huh?
Okay, sorry, please about that. I will.
Okay. Dr. Robert, biography, please. can share it.
Okay, 1 second. Here we share screen. There we go. So the next speaker, so from the RMS side, will be presenting 2 different speakers. And of course, Vivek did touch on the first one, but Robert Muir-Wood is the Chief Research Officer at RMS. He's on the executive board as well. And he's not only very well known, I think, in the industry, but he's actually quite well known basically globally. He has a lot of experiences in the public sector as well. For example, in 2012, he was part of the Mexico presidency of the G20, helping to promote against risk management around natural disasters. He has over 20 years of experience with developing probabilistic models. And actually, I have seen Robert speak throughout the world in many different places throughout my career. And it's an absolute pleasure to be working with him now in the same company. So thank you, Robert, for attending. And the other speaker from RMS that I'll be presenting is Dr. Laurent Marescot. Laurent is, again, the leading catastrophe risk management expert at RMS. He advises many companies in the industry in terms of nat-cat, agriculture, cyber, terrorism risks. He deals with the private and the public sector. And you can more or less see there on the slide the different types of qualifications that he has. Once again, what makes, I think, Laurent quite different and special to many others I've seen in the industry is that he's incredibly passionate about what he does. He really tries to get to the nits and gritty of every single thing that he investigates. And he's very, very passionate about more or less lifting the sector to the next level. So thank you both, gentlemen, for joining today. I'll pass it over now to you, Shakib.
Okay. The next speaker is Mr. Abdelrahim Shafii. Mr. Abdelrahim Shafii هو المدير المسؤول على صندوق الكوارث الطبيعية في المغرب من سنة 2019 والصندوق ابتدأ نشاطه في بداية 2020. الأستاذ عبد الرحيم الشافعي معروف في الأسواق العربية والأسواق العالمية. هو كان مسؤول كان نائب المدير العام في الإسيار موروكو الإعادة المركزية، وكان المدير المسؤول المنتدب في شركة وفاء أسيرانس من 2015 ل 2018. وكما كان نائب المدير العام في شركة زوريخ من سنة 2000 إلى 2010. عبد الرحيم وجه معروف وهو أكتواري، وبالتالي تجربته المغربية ستكون مفيدة بالنسبة لنا. Next speaker please. الأستاذ عبد الرحيم القريشي هو Chief Risk Officer و Chief Actuary السعودي. أحمد القريشي معروف جدا في المملكة العربية السعودية ومعروف برا المملكة العربية السعودية لأنه هو أحد المتخصصين القلائل في الريسك مانجمنت، وبيشتغل على الريسك مانجمنت فريمورك في السعودي، كما أنه بيشتغل في كل ما يخص الاكتواريال اكتيفيتيز، النشاطات الاكتواريه، الريزيرفينج والكابيتال موديلينج الى اخره. قبل ما بيلتحق بالسعودي في 2014 اشتغل احمد 10 سنوات مع ساما اللي هي حاليا البنك المركزي السعودي، ودوره كان هو مراقبه القطاع المالي في المملكه العربيه السعوديه في عدد من الوظائف، من جملتها القطاع المصرفي وبطبيعة الحال شركة تأمين. أحمد دكتور عنده BS ديجري في ماثيماتيكس، في ماثيماتيكس الحسابات من جامعة الملك سعود في السعودية العربية، وعنده ماستر ديجري اوف ارتس ان اكتوال ساينس من بال ستيت يونيفرسيتي في أمريكا، وهو Fellow of Society of Actuaries في أمريكا. Mr. Andre Essel, your biography now. Andre is the first one. Andre is a Swiss Cuban, سويسري بس في نفس الوقت من أصل كوبي، ولد في الأرجنتين. تجول كثير في العالم في العديد من البلدان واشتغل في العديد من البلدان. هو المسؤول عن الاسواق بالخصوص في منطقه الشرق الاوسط، تركيا واسبانيا. وقبل ما بيلتحق بالار ام اس كان رئيس تنفيذي في منطقه الباسيفيكي لجاي كاربنتر، وكان في سيدني. وبعدين اشتغل في كل المنطقه اللي هي الباسيفيك ريجن، منطقه الشرق الادنى، وكان هو المسؤول الاول. وقبل جي كاربنتر اشتغل أندري مع الشركه العملاقه السويسري لمده 17 سنه، وهو عنده دبلوم في الاستراتيجيه، كما انه متخرج من كثير من الاشياء منهم الMIT هذا الاشياء. فالان بنحيل الكلمه للدكتور روبرت موير وود. باسمكم جميعا برحب بالدكتور روبرت موير وود، وهذا شرف لنا دكتور انك تكون معنا في الندوه. Andre, please, the floor is for Dr. Robert, if you allow me.
Could I have access to share screen, please? Okay. So my talk today is on the subject of systemic risk. And I will try and explain what systemic risk is and why it's important for managing risk going forward. So the definition of systemic risk is systemic refers to something that is spread throughout, affecting a group or system such as a body, economy, market, or society as a whole. So we've heard systemic used in the financial sector for the banking crisis in 2008, but systemic has got a much broader sense, and it also applies, as I'll try and explain, to the insurance sector as well. So systemic insurance risk. Systemic risk concerns events that impact many businesses, institutions, individuals, etc. at the same time, causing financial and other losses in which the losses are not directly the result of physical damage. So we understand physical damage, loss from catastrophe. This is systemic risk. Systemic risk can spread because of the interconnectedness of lifelines, risk information, technologies, designs, materials, diseases, anything that can spread through markets, investments, global supply chains, and human contacts. Systemic risks may be regional, national, or global. And the increased global interconnectedness means that systemic risks can spread more widely and rapidly than before. We have this challenge that the values of businesses are increasingly in intangible assets. So if you go back 40 years and the values of industries were in their factories and their machines, and today the values of industries are in their intellectual property, in their capabilities, not in their physical values. And this is where systemic risks can impact. For an insurer, systemic risk costs could arise through a wide range of non-damage related coverages. So in particular, they may or may not be covered by insurance, but there may be ambiguity in the definition of the coverages, which means that systemic risks can be a significant problem. So if we just look at the catastrophe damages, which we're used to, we can split into man-made events like the Beirut explosion or natural disasters. And on the systemic side, we have things like cyber risk, which is not causing physical damage, but business damage, pandemic, and a range of other non-damage impacts. Now, sometimes catastrophes can be so big that the losses spread over into systemic classes. We then have loss processes for catastrophes in replacement cost, in damage-related business interrupted, and we have some systemic factors that can affect even catastrophe loss, and we can have post-event loss amplification, which is really a systemic process putting up the costs of a disaster. And then on the systemic side, we have non-damage business interruption, in particular, is affected by by systemic risk. And then we have catastrophe losses and systemic costs and losses too. So we can think of these two classes of risk and how they relate one to another. The agents of loss for systemic can include a wide number of categories. I mean, they can include the agents of loss, could include the replacement, the interrupted supply chains, denial of access, absenteeism, non-functioning lifelines, cloud or internet closure, event cancellations, litigation, forced closure, discouraged customers. So all of these can be categories which can fall into insurance policies and can pick up systemic losses. A few years ago, our partners in Cambridge Judge Business School came up with a categorization of 11 categories of threats, if you like, of classes of which could cause damage. And I'll just run through the list of them here. Financial shock, trade dispute, geopolitical conflict, political violence, natural catastrophe, climate catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, technological catastrophe, disease outbreak, humanitarian crisis, externality, which means outside the earth. And I want to add another one today to this list, which is what I call paradigm shifts. And I'll try and explain to you how a paradigm shift can be a cause of significant insurance loss. So we have three stages when we have a paradigm shift. We have a theory is developed about the low level of risk, apparently backed by science. An action is taken at multiple locations to apply the theory through creating physical exposure. But later, if the theory is discovered to be wrong, it undermines the original risk assessments. Now there is a widely correlated risk accumulation. Beyond the identification of the risk, we may have actual losses, actual impacts and actual losses, claims for liability, as well as the costs required to rectify the situation. So this is what I call a new paradigm systemic risk cause. The reason I call it a paradigm shift is that it's not simply we've identified a new harm where there was not one before. The new information reverses a previously held view that had encouraged the creation of exposure. And that is why this is a significant factor. And as I say, I'll give you an example of this. So examples of new paradigm systemic risks. In 2017, there was a fire in an apartment complex in London called Grenfell Tower. And what had happened was that the tower had fitted cladding on the outside of the building as an action around climate change, in fact, in order to make the outside walls more insulating, so the energy requirement was lower. But in doing this, the cladding, in fact, we now have discovered it was known to have problems with catching fire, but those problems have been hidden. But as a result of this fire, we now recognize that there are many, many other buildings which are covered with the same cladding as was used in this building, both in the UK and worldwide. And it's both difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to replace this material on these towers. So there's a potential liability and insurability issues to property owners. So suddenly we have discovered a whole new class of systemic risk. And if we look at where this risk is situated, since 2010, there have been 21 facade fires on the outside of buildings, burning up the cladding of buildings. If we look around the world and reports from around the world, and 8 of them were in the United Arab Emirates, 4 of them were in China. So this is a significant risk. A couple of events in the MENA region include the Torch Tower fire in Dubai in 2017 and the Abco Tower in Sharjah in 2020. And we see there's an exponential increase in the occurrence of these events because more and more buildings have been using this cladding externally, and this is a significant source of fire. So here's a new risk. It's systemic and it actually correlates across multiple locations. one problem, if we discover there's a defect in something, I mean, if this is whatever kind of defect, there are many situations where it's extremely expensive and difficult to go back and retrieve the problem, to correct the problem. I mean, for example, if you're in a high-rise building, if you're deep inside a nuclear reactor, if you're a satellite in space, or an offshore wind turbine field, or submarine cable, or transmission system, it's extremely expensive and difficult to correct for a problem if you discover. So suddenly that defect can affect multiple locations, multiple properties, and cause this correlation. And correlation is clearly the enemy of insurance. It's all the time we are trying to avoid situations where losses correlate in this way. Another example of systemic risk, or a function of systemic risk affecting, or systemic perspective affecting catastrophe risk, comes if we only base our estimation of hazard on historical data alone. So for example, we have numerous instances in the past 20 years of events which had no precedent, where we hadn't seen an event like this before. And we can call these events gray swans. They're not truly black swans in that events which we could never have considered, but they're events which are all credible to modeling, but not yet experienced. So the Tohoku earthquake in Japan in 2011, Hurricane Harvey flooding of Houston in 2017, Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The pandemic hazard itself is something which we have not seen before, but we have suspected an event like this can happen. Cyber hazards like the NotPetya malware attack, 9/11 terrorism hazard, wildfire hazard, as in California in 2017 and 2018. So these are all gray swans. They're credible events, not yet experienced, and it's a systemic challenge to move from a historical perspective on catastrophe risk to actually understanding what has the potential to be out there. That's why we need modeling. That's why the kind of risk models that RMS builds are so critical. So just one instance of the challenges of this is, if you like, a paradigm shift. People around the world and in Japan believed for a while that actually that if you look simply at history for where the big earthquakes had occurred, there had not been a big earthquake on the Pacific coast of Japan for hundreds of years. And it was assumed that therefore the hazard was lower along this coastline. And as a result, 14 nuclear power plants were built along the Pacific coast of Japan. And even after the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, we should have identified that there was a significant risk. It wasn't fully recognized. And so in March 11th, 2011, 10 years ago, we had an unanticipated 15-meter tsunami overwhelming the backup generators after the transmission lines had failed. And this, if you like, was a consequence of a systemic perspective of believing that history was enough to tell us everything that could happen. And we know that we now know we can't just rely on history alone to tell us about what has the potential to happen. We know, for example, along the north coast of Oman, there is now evidence that there has been significant tsunami along this coast from the Makran subduction zone on the opposing Iranian coast, that an event happened about 1,000 years ago, which actually, where the waves were large enough to throw huge boulders up onto the cliffs. This is a boulder being where it can be dated as to when it arrived there about 1,000 years ago. So we have a situation here where we cannot simply rely on historical information. We need to have a modeling perspective of risk. And we know that a significant tsunami could impact wide areas along the north coast of Oman, many harbors and ports and what is located there. And clearly, while this is a very rare event, we must consider it as a possibility and actually explore the accumulation that is concentrated along this coast, for example, from an event of this kind. A similar situation applies around tropical cyclone risk in the Gulf. There's now modeling work done by leading hurricane expert Kerry Emanuel of actually looking at what and where cyclones can occur around the Gulf. And this team has found that actually it is possible to get a tropical cyclone inside the Persian Gulf. So you know, really in the vicinity of Dubai, for example, but just offshore. their modeling suggests this almost certainly wouldn't be a cyclone at peak intensity like Cyclone Gonu in 2007, but actually could. They estimate a storm surge hazard in Dubai of 1.9 meters at 1,000-year return period and 4 meters at 10,000-year return period, with the potential to cause erosion damage to artificial islands, to bring wind damage and very widespread flooding. Again, this is an extreme event, but it's an event which probably should be looked at in terms of just actually accumulation modeling, just to check that it is being assessed properly. So this question about identifying systemic risk, this is an example in Thailand, where the government set up a whole series of massive industrial parks in the 1990s. And in order to find land on which to build, they wanted cheap, flat land not previously built on, which is another definition for a floodplain. The biggest parks were all located close to Bangkok in the floodplain of the same river. And there was no real consideration given to the risk at the time, or the systemic correlation of the risk. And it then took the autumn 2011 rainfall and floods, which flooded all these parks and caused very significant losses, 45 billion of direct loss, 15 billion insured, and probably greater than 10 billion of supply chain disruption. Again, this was a systemic correlated risk. We've had situations like the Icelandic eruption of 2010, which threw ash into the upper atmosphere and led to the cancellation of 107,000 flights across Northern Europe and caused a 1.7 billion economic loss. Again, this wasn't caused by damage. It was caused, if you like, by the fear of the unknown, the fear of actually knowing what could happen to jet engines in this situation. Climate change is another risk which you can think of in the same way as a paradigm shift. If we went back to the late 19th century, we were using oil and coal to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And it was only in the sort of 1980s, 1990s that it was recognized that actually there was a problem with running the whole economy on fossil fuels, that actually it was giving out greenhouse gases that were causing the climate to change. And these harms are starting to accelerate. And now we have a paradigm shift in that with the focus on decarbonizing the economy, with all sorts of potential implications, both insured and non-insured, liability for not actually rapidly reducing emissions, potential for stranded assets around fossil fuels and so on. So here's, if you like, the consequence of a paradigm shift actually bringing forward a large amount of risk. So, and climate change can bring systemic risks in a number of areas. We find if we have evidence for an acceleration in annual sea level rise, that will depreciate property values at coasts worldwide. If we have an acceleration in flood severity, that will affect values in and beyond the current floodplains. We may have multiple simultaneous and overlapping disasters. We may have accelerated disinvestment in fossil fuels. We may have long-term drought leading to depletion of groundwater resources, rise in heat waves, outside work impossible, and so on. So many, many things which can happen systemically as a consequence of climate change. And to think through, to get you trying to look around you and identify the next class of systemic risk. If we have something which is correlated, you might say that's halfway towards getting a systemic outcome. So if two companies are using the same software or the same cloud services, or employing the same infrastructure or the same financier, or even the same insurer, or the same port or access route or hazard theory or partner, that correlation could become a function of systemic risk. If there's some defect identified, it will then correlate across those other partners that are in the same area. So this is sort of just I mean, my intention today is to encourage more thinking around identifying future sources of systemic risk, like the facade fires on high-rise buildings, for example. And lastly, just to help you identify where to expect systemic risk. Systemic risk, I mean, I believe, also exists in how insurance is actually written. And you can ask the question, is underwriting itself a systemic risk? Now, we had this significant problem with COVID-19 last year that that insurers, and this is an example in the UK, insurers discovered they were covering COVID-19 business interruption losses, but they didn't mean to. It was simply the ambiguity and the wording they used, and the fact that actually underwriters might do a special deal and extend coverage to certain of their clients. I mean, the Lloyd's agency Hiscox lost about $500 million simply through the fact that they had been careless in how the terms of coverage have been written. And yeah, there's been a lawsuit in the UK in the Supreme Court, which oversaw the High Court proceedings of actually looking at this challenge of the interpretation of clauses in non-damage BI covers. And I mean, what is most extraordinary about it is that it's just how much diversity there was in how this business had been written. That the High Court only considered 21 sample wordings, but it's estimated there were 700 types of policies written across 370,000 policyholders with 60 different insurers, and they were all doing different things, and all of them, in many situations, they inadvertently picked up losses simply because they had not thought through what would happen in a pandemic. They were thinking about local outbreaks of disease. So the function of insurance has really to be cleaned up and simplified in order to avoid these situations where unintended coverage creeps in through some systemic event of this kind. So that's the conclusion of what I have to say. I hope this has been sort of interesting and useful. And as I say, I'm most interested in encouraging thinking around anticipating where is the next class of catastrophe loss going to come from? How can we prepare for it better? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert. Before leaving the floor to Andre and to Laurent, I would like to thank you really for reminding us about the cladding, because I remember when I was in Dubai, I was a reinsurance broker, and one of the main concerns in Dubai was the cladding, and it's still the cladding, because if something happened, it's become progressively a kind of systemic risk. And I remember the insurer giving instruction to companies, and some companies are not even authorized to see to their treaties buildings with cladding. And the Glen Tower was really a wake-up call for everybody. Thank you, Dr. Robert. Can I will do something which is not usual. There was a question, a very interesting question from one of our colleagues, Osama Noor. He was asking, in what category do you put Beirut blast? Is it a gray swan? I'm sorry to ask this question because we were supposed to ask later on, but I want to ask you this question because our public in the Middle East is very concerned about the Beirut blast. In which category you put the Beirut explosion?
Yeah, no, the Beirut explosion is absolutely a gray swan. I mean, you have the correlation, if you like, even if we did not know that there was a huge amount of fertilizer being stored in the port, we could identify the potential for a correlated loss. I mean, we have seen this port explosion in China a few years ago. So we should be modeling the potential for a massive explosion at any port on the basis that actually the losses would then be correlated in that way. So yes, it is very much a gray swan.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. Just I want to say something. The registered reached now 998. We need to close 1,000, and the peak of the attendees was 300, I think 31 or 29. I don't remember. Thank you all for attending. Andre, I think it's time for Laurent to speak. Do you have anything to add or?
Yo, absolutely. So again, what a wonderful attendance, and thank you so much, Robert. Every single time you speak, you make us all think about tomorrow. And the way that RMS wanted to basically give the audience today a bit of our flavor in terms of IP and know-how was one particular subject spoken by Robert, which is very macro and high level, the gray swans, the black swans, and then another subject that's much more down to everyday to reality, floods and other natural catastrophes in the MENA region. And for that, Laurent, you're the expert. Take it over, buddy.
Thank you very much, Andy. I hope we can, I will just start to share my screen. Here we go. Hopefully you can see it. Yes? Okay. So, bonjour à tous. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Rather than I will spend on the next 15 minutes to give you a brief overview on what you can do already today for managing those risks. It's a very practical standpoint and perspective, actually. And it's really what you can do today to improve your nat-cat and man-made risks. What are the tools around that could be used already today in the MENA region, and also how RMS can help you from that perspective. So as Robert explained, actually the MENA region is exposed to many nat-cat perils, and there is, of course, an evolving risk landscape, especially when we combine some changes around climate change, or, of course, the increased amount of exposure at risk. And there is, of course, a special concern around flood, as you said, Andy, especially like flash floods coming from excessive precipitation that could basically hit many countries in the region, including Morocco, Algeria, Iraq, Yemen, Tunisia, or Saudi Arabia. So RMS, from that perspective, has 30 years of expertise in developing and solutions to manage those risks you see around traditional natural catastrophes such as earthquake, cyclone, wildfire, flood, severe convective storm like hail that could happen. I mean, we had a pretty impressive event again in Saudi Arabia in the past few years. But also in terms of the man-made risk, really about managing better terrorism risk, cyber risk, pandemic, and longevity. And we have been using that to serve actually different stakeholders in the industry. So here, I guess most of the audience is about insurance or reinsurance and maybe brokers, but we have also been engaging with those solutions a lot on the corporate side, the financial service side, the public sector side. So just to give you a few examples that maybe are interesting for you in terms of the climate change is really understanding the potential impact of climate change on current and near future and long-term future insurance business, or even on for the banking sector about climate change as a risk of increasing mortgage defaults, as an example. We have been also engaging quite a lot around the silent cyber aspect of the risk, you know, the fact that a property policy like fire risk could be triggered by a cyber event. It has been, at least also in Europe, a big topic around that for regulatory discussions. And RMS, of course, as I would say, a pretty interesting role, an important role in this process, because as Yvette explained, we have all this long-term experience in modeling those risks. But in the definition of what we do every day, one word is very important, is this independent perspective we provide. We are not bearing any risk. We are not part of the insurance system from that perspective in terms of trading the risk. We are an independent model providers. And from that perspective, that's a privilege and also responsibility on our side to develop the models that make sense to the market and that are most useful for trading the risk. And so that's very where our core role has been in the past. So for a company, maybe when you are facing your challenges about managing nat-cat risk and man-made risks, maybe all the solution I showed to you, you probably know that it's probabilistic model, it's very advanced modeling solutions, and maybe some of you do not feel they have the technicity or even the data to run those complex models, which is a very fair point. So at RMS, I mean, to address that issues or that situation more, we have actually a very pragmatic way of managing risk, which is really starting with the basics. As you can see, there is like a tiered approach into managing your risk. We start, I would say, with the basic, which is knowing your exposure. So, for example, understand where the different risks are in your portfolio and what could be the hotspot of accumulation. Then, of course, a more advanced solution is to be able to run scenario loss modeling, so deterministic models, so what if scenarios, what if this event could happen tomorrow here on my book of business. So you see that's pretty another level of technology to be involved, but that's not you know, very complex to actually put in action. And of course, then you have the more complex solution that requires, I would say, the technicity, the data to run that, but that could provide not only the severity of a loss, but also the probability of that loss, what an EML or a PML, if you want, from that perspective. That is really used trading reinsurance, structuring reinsurance contract as an example. So in this presentation, I just want to focus actually on the two bottom blocks, because that's probably, I mean, where you could find very interesting or inspiration that you can already put in action in your risk management processes tomorrow. So let's start with exposure management. Probably one of the very first think into understanding your exposure management is a bit understanding where those risks are. So it's really being able to qualify those risks, to locate those risks in your book of business, to understand, for example, what is the insured value that is concentrated in a country, in a region, like a zip code or a CRISTA zone, or any kind of administrative boundary you could define, or even dig deeper, I would say, in terms of individual risks. Understand, you know, like in the city of Riyadh, if you have different risks spread over the city, where are those risks, right? And even drill down to the individual risk perspective, right? An individual building. And it's very interesting because, of course, it's the first way to understand your risk. Maybe you have those solutions already in-house. It's a mix, I would say, of data management and visualization of your exposure. But it's also, I think, has a pretty interesting aspect of triggering an improvement of your exposure quality. So, for example, understand which are the features that you need to collect for those different risks to be able to manage nat-cat risk and basically use those tools in a more advanced way. So I would say exposure understanding and accumulation and visualization is probably also the first step to trigger the improvement in exposure quality. Of course, once you have that, you can start to run, I would say, interesting metrics on your exposure. And again, it's we have tools to on the market that is doing exactly that. So, for example, you can define simple accumulation, which is just understanding in a simple shape, like a circle, a radius of, let's say, 1 kilometer or 200 meters, how much of insured value you have there. Where are your hotspots? It could be on insured value or on losses, because you can, of course, factor some policy information. And also, basically, what is very much used in Europe, including for Solvency II, for the regulatory reporting, is identifying your hotspots. So we have at RMS, as an example, a tool which is called the spider analysis, which is very famous on the market. It's actually, you can imagine a spider crawling on its web, and it's exactly that. So you define, let's say, a region, and it will, you know, screen your book of business and identify, for example, the top 10 accumulation pockets within a radius of 200 meters, as an example. And this is, again, something that is extremely used and enforced by regulatory authorities in Europe for Solvency II. Every insurance company has to report that to the regulatory bodies. Again, it's a very simple step to manage your accumulation, but or sorry, your nat-cat risk. But this accumulation process is very useful and very easy to put in action. Now we can move to this kind of accumulations, very simple scenario to more advanced scenario. And here I just want to maybe echo the discussion we had right before that with Robert about the Beirut explosion as an example. So that's really showing that we can also define very simple scenarios in those tools that could replicate real events. So, for example, after the Beirut explosion last year, RMS, collected data from that explosion and information, and released very quickly to our client base, modeling parameter that could help to replicate that event on their book of business. So it is really like a simple format, let's say, of concentric accumulation circle with different damage ratios. So we analyzed basically the power of that explosion, and actually we used our advanced terrorism risk modeling and understanding about blast over pressure physics to actually transfer that into this equivalent of that explosion. So it's, again, a very simple way of managing your risk. You can to respond after an event like in Beirut, but also as we discussed right before, you could take that scenario and move it to different other ports globally or in the MENA region and understand what if basically we have this kind of explosive situation again that could happen there, and again try to better understand that gray swarm we have been talking about. So that's probably really an example of simple deterministic scenario providing you a loss estimate for a simple kind of event that could be characterized by this kind of footprint. Now, when we talk about more advanced solution, we can still do a lot of things without having actually to run very complex modeling. So I just give you an example. We talk about flood as a very important peril in the MENA region. It's increasing because the trend is up, right, for this flood event. So at RMS, of course, we spend a lot of time to develop those very complex probabilistic model. We have one for Europe, one for US, we have Japan and other places. But of course, it takes years to develop and calibrate those complex models. So we try again to be pragmatic and find solution to deliver also flood intelligence, flood risk intelligence in globally. So just to give you an example here in this exercise, what we are doing is providing basically flood hazard maps or information based on complete hydrological models. So we have used our complete hydrodynamic complex model in a machine learning exercise to train basically an algorithm to replicate those floods features we have in those models, and then of course to be able to export that knowledge in regions where we do not have a model. Just to give you an example about how this looks like, so you see on the map here on the top, that's it's a 100-year return period floods from our complete hydrodynamic model, very complex model. It's in Philadelphia, US, and we trained basically the model on that to replicate this kind of features. And you see on the bottom the machine learning model equivalent, and you see the main features are captured, right? And then we can, of course, once the training is achieved, export that, in Asia, in Africa, or in the Middle East. So I'll just give you a few examples about the Middle East region because I had that from a developer. So that's an example of a flood map for 100-year return period for the region of Riyadh. So you see basically the kind of high definition features we have capturing those excess of precipitation, I would say, in a different topographic features and the wadis we have there. It's another example in Doha, in Qatar, where you have a bit the same features. And that's also interesting because we have this for different return periods, and it's capturing all sorts of flooding. So I would say in Riyadh or in Doha, most of the risk is coming from this flash flood, the excess of rain. But now maybe it would be interesting to have a look on other places where we have long river system and basically understand that actually any kind of source of flooding is captured there. It's not only just precipitation, pluvial risk, as you have in those two examples, but also excess of water coming actually from the river system, as you can see here in an example. It's not in the Middle East, but it's in Belgrade in Serbia, where you have, of course, the obvious flooding coming from the Danube River. So that's also an inspiration, because once you have those tools, you can start to run accumulation on that, understand what is your exposed risk for flooding. You can even define, if you want some damage ratio, you can imagine to create some deterministic loss model, and again, have a positive impact on your risk management and build your expertise so that in the future you could use also more advanced modeling solution for the risk management. So, so I hope it gives you a little bit of this overview about what immediate action item you can do today to improve your risk management for nat-cat, but also for man-made. You see, we have those tools. Maybe some of you already use those tools. Maybe some of you may find interesting to put that also in action. It has, of course, positive impact on your own business, on the way you underwrite, you manage your risk, and you basically build your portfolio, you grow your portfolio without creating any bias. And also you can see that, of course, it has impact also on, I would say, your business, the way you do business, right? So basically the way you could plan your strategies, you can improve your loss ratio, and also you could grow business with more confidence in terms offering more coverage to the people. So falling back also to the discussion, I think it's also a topic of offering more confidence into risk management to narrow down that protection gap and helping our communities to be more resilient. So yes, Shakib, I'm done now. Hopefully not too much over time. I just want one slide to, and probably we'll have time for a lot of Q&A and discussion on that. I'm happy to answer to that. So as it's just an action item, I think for the people, as I said, please engage with us if you find some of that is interesting. We are happy to hear also from your expertise about how you can best help in the region. We are happy to learn from you how we can basically use these 30 years of scientific perspective, put that in action for the MENA region. We also released, as you can see, in 2020, now actually the 2020 Catastrophe Reports. A lot of it is about pandemics, but you can download that if you're interested. And you're also very welcome to join us at our RMS Exceedance conference in May. It's our official client conference, but this year it's open to everyone, to non-client as well. So just join us if you are interested. Yes, I let the floor back to Shakib. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurent. It was very interesting. Before leaving the ground to my friend Abdelrahim Shafi'i, just I would like to say that we have reached now 1,000 registered. It's 1,334 attendees, and this is a good performance for us, and it shows how important is the subject. Now in Morocco, they have today what they call DEFSEC, which is the Fonds de Solidarité des Catastrophes Naturelles. And I think the best person to introduce the Moroccan experience is Mr. Abdelrahim Shafi'i. Abdelrahim, الكلمة لك. تفضل الأخ الكريم. Abdelrahim will بيتكلم باللغة العربية. Abdelrahim will speak in Arabic.
اوكي، شكرا استاذ شكيب على الاستضافه. فوالا، كاين البارطاج ياك؟
نعم، يس.
شكرا سيد شكيب لهذه الاستضافه اللي من خلالها غادي نحاول نقدم ما قد تم عمله وما هي المسائل التي سيتم تفعيلها بالنسبه للمغرب للحد من مخاطر او لتغطيه مخاطر الكوارث بالمغرب. في البداية سأقوم بإعطاء نظرة عامة عن تغطية المخاطر. فالحكومة المغربية اشتغلت عن هذا الموضوع ما يناهز 20 سنة، عقدين من الزمن، انطلاقا من الخطاب الملكي السامي الذي وجه للأمة بعد زلزال الحسيمة في 2004. بدأت العمل، ومن هذا التاريخ بدأ العمل في بلورة واحد استراتيجية للحد من الحد من الكوارث. إذن بدأ الاشتغال انطلاقا من 2004، وفي 2016 تم اعتماد سياسة جديدة لتدبير الكوارث والمخاطر المتعلقة بالمناخ، مع التركيز على تعزيز الحد من المخاطر والتأهب المسبق للكوارث. وفي هذا الإطار تمت جوج ديال المحاور الكبرى. المحور الأول أن الدولة أقرت قانونا جديدا للتعويض عن آثار الكوارث، والذي دخل حيز التنفيذ كما قلت الأستاذ شكيب انطلاقا من 1 يناير 2020. وكذلك كانت هناك تفعيل استراتيجية وطنية لإدارة المخاطر والكوارث باش تكون هناك استباقية ويمكن الحد ببعض الاستثمارات الحد من المخاطر. فالقانون المغربي، لأن الوقت ما كيسمحش باش يكون هناك توضيح كبير، فهذا القانون هو إطار تنظيمي مزدوج فيه جوج ديال المحاور. هناك نظام خاص للتأمين لشركات التأمين وهو إلزامي على جميع عقود التأمين بالخصوص No Life Business، وأصبح امتداد التأمين على الوقائع الكارثية تلقائيا، ليس هناك أي اختيار. إذا كانت عندك بوليصة التأمين فهناك التأمين على الوقائع الكارثية تلقائيا. وحتى تكون هناك تغطية لجميع الأفراد، فقد أحدث صندوق التضامن ضد الوقائع الكارثية والذي بدأ الاشتغال انطلاقا من 1 يناير 2020، والذي الهدف ديالو والهدف منه هو تعويض الكوارث التي تحدث أضرارا بالسكن الرئيسي وللأشخاص الغير المؤمنين. هناك نسبة تغطية ديال التأمين ضعيفة في المغرب بالنسبة للأشخاص على المنازل، أقل من 2%. إذن حتى يمكن أن يكون هناك تغطية شاملة لجميع المغاربة أحدث هذا الصندوق. فبالنسبة فبالنسبة للتمويل هذه التغطية، فتمت هناك إحداث أقساط تأمين محددة بالقانون. القانون حدد أقساط التأمين، وكذلك حدد هناك رسم شبه ضريبي لفائدة لصندوق التضامن. فكيف اشتغلنا لبناء هذه المنظومة؟ كان لابد أننا نشتغل على تحديد ما سيكون ك financial losses بالنسبة لهذا القانون. إذن لأن يجب أن نقوم بحسابات حتى يكون عندنا ما هي الترتبات المالية في حالة إذا وقعت هناك كارثة. فبالنسبة للمغرب اخترنا تطوير ندمجة خاصة، وذلك لعدم وجود حينها نماذج متوفرة من طرف الشركات المختصة like RMS. فمثلا غادي نعطي واحد النظرة على تطوير نموذج الفيضانات اللي اعتمد في العمل ديالنا. هناك لكي نقوم بهذا تطوير هذا البرنامج انطلقنا بتطوير هازارد كاتالوج بالنسبة للمغرب، كل المغرب على كله. وكذلك كانت هناك دراسات لتطوير some vulnerability curves. إذا وقع هذا الهازارد سيقوم بتفعيل هذا vulnerability curve التي ستحدد حسب الاكسبوزيشن ما مدى الخسائر المتوقعة. دونك هنا اشتغلنا على هذه المسائل. فمثلا إذا أخذنا هازارد كاتالوج، انطلقنا في تطوير هازارد كاتالوج انطلقنا من النماذج المستعملة في الأرصاد الجوية لمعرفة نسبة التدفق المائي، والذي يعطينا تقديرا لعلو المياه بعد الفيضانات. وهذه العلو المياه هي التي تعطينا حسب the vulnerability cover ما هي نسبة الخسائر. إذن هذه هي النظام اللي اشتغلنا به. وكذلك كنشوفوا هنا وقع كما نرى هنا في هذه الصورة، هناك يمكننا معرفة خروج المياه على المجاري ديالها، واللي كيعطينا تحديد الخسائر كما شرح لورون بعد قليل. المشكل هنايا سي كيف يتم احتساب اللوس استيميشن. عندنا insurance value من exposition، عندنا probability loss from hazard catalog and destruction ratio اللي كناخذوه من هاد vulnerability curve. اعتذر عن العربيه عندي شويه ضعيفه، ولكن غادي نحاول نكمل presentation. كان عندنا هناك مشكل ان جميع بالنسبه للبيانات او الاكسبوزيشن اللي عندنا المتوفره التي كانت بحوزتنا، لم يكن عندنا المعلومات مسكن بمسكن. فاضطرينا اننا انطلقنا من البيانات الاحصاء العام للسكان والسكنى الموجود، الاحصاء ديال سنه 2014 اخر احصاء تم في المغرب، وتم تطوير نظام معلوماتي يعطينا معلومات خاصة عن كل مسكن. وهذه المعلومات التي تم إخراجها هي المعلومات الموجودة هنا. يعطينا ما هي مساحة مثلا المسكن، هنا مساحة 96 متر مربع، ما هي GPS value ومعلومات كثيرة. هل هذا المسكن هو مكترى او هو مقتني؟ جميع المعلومات هنا. وهنا عندنا هذه المعلومات ديكسبوزيشن، هما المعلومات اللي غادي يشتغل عليهم النظام باش يعطينا نسبة الخسائر. وكما قال الدكتور لورون في الحديث ديالو، إذا حصلنا على مجموعة من طورنا واحد المجموعة من الأدوات التي تمكننا من تقدير الخسائر حسب فترة العودة period of return هنايا، وكذلك تقدير الخسائر المؤمنة والغير المؤمنة. هنا في الأزرق هي جميع الخسائر، بالنسبة هنا باللون البرتقالي هي الخسائر ديال قطاع التأمين، وبالأخضر هي الخسائر ديال القطاع الأفسك. إذن ما بين هذا اللون الازرق والمجموع ديال هذه الالوان هي الخسائر الاخرى اللي كتبقى تحت كاهل الحكومه المغربيه. اذا حاولت نكون سريع لان الوقت جد ضئيل، ولكن كان عطاني باش نقدر نوضح لكم ما قمنا به من اجل اخراج هذا النظام، وما هي المسائل الأولية التي يجب القيام بها. وكما قيل لا يمكن إحداث نظام لتغطية الكوارث بدون تكون هناك واحد المجموعة ديال الوسائل اللي تقدر تعطينا حجم الخسائر، وبهذه الخسائر يمكننا معرفة ما هي التداعيات المالية لهذا البرنامج اللي كنديروا، وما سيساعدنا كذلك حتى بالذهاب إلى الأسواق ديال إعادة التأمين باش تكون عندنا تعريفات جد مناسبة. شكرا.
شكرا أستاذ عبد الرحيم. العربية نتاعك أظنها أنه جيدة.
شكرا.
صحيح أنه في شوية كلمات مغربية، فبالنسبة لي أنا ما في إشكال، بس بالنسبة للمترجمين بتصور كانت في شوية صعوبة. على كل حال
للمترجمين
مترجمين، وحتى بالنسبه لغير شمال افريقيين لغير الناس. بس على كل حال انا بقدر لك مجهودك، لان اللغه العمليه بالنسبه لك ولا لغه العمل بالنسبه لك هي اللغه الفرنسيه، فانت استعملت خليط ما بين اللغه العربيه. بالنسبه للتجربه المغربيه انا بس بدي اطلب منك توضيح، لان في المغرب فيه نظامين، في نظام اللي هو النظام نتاع الصندوق اللي انت مسؤول عنه، وفيه النظام اللي هو تديره شركه الكات. النظام اللي تديره شركه الكات انت بتعرف على انه هو قسط يؤخذ على كل بوليصه تامين. فبالتالي اليوم في المغرب عندنا في نظامين، نظام اللي هو بيغطي الناس الغير المؤمنين اللي هو حضرتك انت المسؤول عنه، والنظام الثاني اللي هو مسؤوله عنه شركه الكات اللي هو للناس اللي عندهم وثيقه تامين. فانت حسب رايك، هل لما بنجمع هذان النظامين هل فينا نقولوا على انه اجمالا انه المغرب كله مغطى، ان الناس كلهم محميين؟ هذا هو سؤالي.
سؤال جد مهم، لأن إذا نظرنا إلى التغطية ديال نظام التأمين شركات التأمين، فهناك سقف في السنة أو سقف باي ايفنت. إذا كان هناك سقف يمكن أن يحدث واحد الكارثة اللي تقدر غادا تفوت، ستفوق هذا السقف، وعند ذلك الحين سيكون هناك تعويضات أقل ما هو في عقود التأمين. بالنسبة لصندوق التضامن ليس هناك سقف، السقف هو محدد بالموارد المالية التي يتوفر عليها. إذا هذه الموارد المالية اللي عندنا التي نتوفر عليها هي كما قلت الموارد من الرسم شبه الضريبي، هناك مساعدة من الدولة المغربية كمساهمة في هذا الصندوق. كذلك قمنا بشراء تغطية من عند شركات إعادة التأمين، قمنا بالتغطية من عند شركات إعادة التأمين، ونحن سنشتغل عما قريب in order to build a cat bond coverage. سنكون عند هذا الكات بوند كوفرج. نحن نتمنى أن يكون حيز التطبيق انطلاقا من بداية 2023. نحن الآن بدأنا الدراسة، لأن هناك مسائل أكثر تعقيد، لأن كتعامل مع مستثمرين ماليين وليس مع شركة تأمين أو إعداد تأمين اللي عندهم إلمام بهذا بميدان التأمين. لكن هناك مجموعة ديال التقارير والدراسات استباقية التي يجب أن نقوم بها من أجل إعطاء صندوق التضامن الموارد التي يمكن له أن يشتغل بها حتى يقوم بأداء دوره في أحسن الظروف. هناك هذه هي الحالة الآن. ميكرو سي شكيب.
شكرا أستاذ عبد الرحيم. Andre, do you have something to say? Or it is okay with you? We will not ask the question now, if you don't mind. Can I pass the mic, to our friend Ahmed? أحمد تفضل. أحمد، أهلا وسهلا بك. أحمد القريشي من السعودية. بعد ما استمعنا لوجهات النظر اللي هي نقدر نسميها وجهات نظر عامة ماكرو ايكونوميك أو ماكرو اقتصادية، اللي هي وجهة نظر حكومية، صندوق وممول من طرف الحكومة، الآن بننتقل لشركة اللي هي فعلا مهتمة بالموضوع هذه، وهي السعودي ري. وأنا بهنيهم السعودي ري على أنهم أول شيء على النتائج نتاعهم، لأن البارح ظهرت النتائج نتاعهم وكانت نتائج ممتازة جدا بالنسبة لسنة 2020. وكذلك نهنيهم على الاتفاق اللي أبرموه مع RMS. فلو يسمح لي أحمد القريشي، تفضل أستاذ أحمد.
السلام عليكم.
ورحمة الله. أستاذ أحمد.
شكرا استاذ شكيب، شكرا للدعوه واعطاني فرصه للمشاركه. فمره ثانيه اشكركم وشكرا على مهنات على النتائج، والحمد لله النتائج ل 2020 كانت ايجابيه على رغم الظروف الاقتصاديه والكورونا كوفيد-19 اللي صارت خلال هالفتره، لكن الحمد لله النتائج كانت ايجابيه خلال الفتره هذه. وايضا اشكرك على تهنئتنا على الشراكه الجديده مع RMS، وان شاء الله هذه الشراكه يكون لها يعني نتائج ايجابيه على المدى البعيد، خاصه في المملكه العربيه السعوديه، وبناء نماذج بناء مخاطر للكوارث الطبيعيه. الهدف منها يعني تقييم المخاطر وضمان الامان الاقتصادي للمملكه، وايضا ضمان قطاع التامين بوجود شركات تامين وشركات اعاده تامين قادره على اداره المخاطر وتقييمها وتسعيرها بشكل طبيعي او بشكل عادل. احنا في البدايه انا بحاول اعطي نبذه عن ممكن الاخوان في الكلمات السابقه ذكروا تفاصيل عن بعض المخاطر اللي تتعرض لها خاصه في المنطقه العربيه، وذكروا منها السعوديه، فبحاول ممكن اعيدها بس ممكن اذكرها بطريقه اخرى. وفي بعض التوجهات وبعض المبادرات من الحكومه فيما يخص من ضمن رؤيه 2030 فيما يخص اداره المخاطر والكوارث، لانها في بداياتها، لكن ان شاء الله انها بروميسنج، ودور الحكومه هنا مهم في زي المثال المغربي مهم في تبني مثل هذه المشاريع، لانها يهم في النهايه اقتصاد الدوله ونموها. فهنا انا حاب بس اعطي بالبرزنتيشن تصور عن المخاطر اللي تتعرض لها الجزيره العربيه وبالتحديد المملكه العربيه السعوديه. فهنا اكثر المخاطر اللي تتعرض لها المملكه العربيه السعوديه من ناحيه التاثير الاقتصادي هو تعتبر الزلازل الارضيه. هذه انا اخذت بس عينه للزلازل اللي قوتها اكثر من 2.5 من بدايه عام 2000 الى تقريبا قبل يومين، وتبين عدد كل ما كانت الدائره اكبر كل ما كانت قوه الزلزال او الماجنتيود اكبر، وهذه عددها حسب من عام 2000، وعددها تقريبا اجمالي 3633. النقطه المهمه يعني اكبر هزه ارضيه ان هذا لو تلاحظون يمثل اللي هو مصدر الزلزال او يسمونه خط الزلزال اللي محاط به المملكه العربيه السعوديه. فبالغالب حتكون المناطق المملكه العربيه اكثر تاثيرا اللي هي المنطقه الغربيه وبعض المناطق من المنطقه الشرقيه. اكثر زلزال تم رصده عام 1950 في خليج العقبه هنا. الاشكاليه الان اللي من ضمن توجه الحكومه الان اللي هم مشاريع التنمويه ومن المشاريع الاقتصاديه، ما ادري اذا كان في عدد كبير اسمه مشروع نيوم حيكون هنا في المنطقه هذه، وهي نفس المنطقه نيوم هنا وضح اكثر. نيوم حتكون بنفس المنطقه هنا، وهي تقريبا اكبر زلزال صار بالسعوديه عام 1950 مقدار 7.2. فهنا هذا يعني يتطلب منا او دور الشركات البحوث زي الارمس انهم يقومون بسوي دراسات على الطبيعه او الجيولوجيا للمملكه العربيه السعوديه، وكيف ان نقيس مخاطر الزلازل. هنا يعني مقدار جسامه الموضوع، فهذا يتطلب احيانا دور اكبر من الحكومه. حاليا الحكومه من ضمن رؤيه 2030 تم انشاء اداره بالمخاطر والكوارث الطبيعيه، وعندهم اكثر من مبادرات، وان شاء الله انها من ضمن المبادرات هذه انشاء صناديق الكوارث الطبيعيه. وهنا يعني يبرز دور قطاع التامين في كيف اداره المخاطر. فبالتالي يعني نشجع ونتفهم يعني بعض قيود اللي على شركات البحوث خاصه زي RMS في مساله اذا ما كان في دعم للقيام بهالبحوث وتطوير نماذج للمخاطر في المملكه العربيه السعوديه. من ضمن او ثاني مخاطر يعني واجه المملكه العربيه السعوديه وتم ذكره في اكثر من فقره اليوم اللي هي الكوارث الطبيعيه فيما يخص الفيضانات. الفيضانات هذه صارت اكثرها مؤخرا في السنوات الاخيره وكانت اغلبها في مدينه جده، والاشكاليه الكبيره كانت في تصاميم تصاريف المياه، وكانت في مشاريع كبيره خلال الفتره الماضيه، ففي تحسن من ناحيه قله او تاثير الحوادث الناتجه عن الامطار، لكن حاليا نحتاج الاستثمار في النماذج في تقدير المخاطر هذه، وبناء عليها نقدر احنا كقطاع مالي او بالاساس الحكومه او الاقتصاد يقدر يقيم تاثيرها، لانه بالنهايه هذه حيكون لها تاثير على اقتصاد البلد بالنهايه. فهذا شيء مهم كيف يدار. النقطة الثالثة وهو يعني ما يمكن يكون مباشر للمملكة العربية السعودية، لكن خاصة بعض المناطق من السعودية ممكن، وخاصة اليمن وعمان هم يعني معرضين هذا، لأنهم هم قريب من خط الاستواء. فهذا خط الاستواء، فهنا في المنطقة اللي تكون في المحيط بعض الأعاصير لها فترات معينة خلال السنة، فهذه ممكن تكون لها تأثير على الخليج العربي خاصة اليمن وعمان. وآخر حادثة اللي كانت عام 2018 مكونو، إعصار مكونو، وكان تأثير يعني جوهري أو تأثير كبير على الانشورنس اندستري وعلى القطاع أو على القطاع الاقتصادي خاصة في عمان، أو الموانئ في الخاصة المحاذية للمحيط. فهذه أنا حبيت نعطي نبذة عن المخاطر اللي تواجه السعودية أو المملكة العربية السعودية، وإنه في توجه من الحكومة في بناء مبادرات في إدارة المخاطر هذه. إحنا السعودية دورنا يعني إحنا as part of our initiative we partnership أو تعاوننا مع RMS to have أو بداية العلاقة مع RMS إنه بناء أو استخدام النماذج المخاطر المعتمدة من قبلهم، وفي أمل إن شاء الله أن يكون في تطوير للنماذج الموجودة في السعودية، ونأمل أن يكون في تعاون من الحكومة خاصة من البنك المركزي سامة في تبني هالمشاريع، لأنها بالنهاية لها تأثير جوهري على اقتصاد البلد، والهدف منها أكبر من القطاع المالي، سلامة الاقتصاد وسلامة الاقتصادي واستمراريته وعدم تاثر بالكوارث الطبيعيه لا سمح الله. هذه استاذ شكيب مختصر او نبذه عن المملكه، وحبيت يعني اختصر فيها، فشكرا. واذا كان اي استفسار او لك الكلمه استاذ شكيب.
Andre, before giving the floor to you, I have a question to Ahmed. Thank you, Ahmed, for this presentation. And again, I'm very proud, to see that Saudi Re now is starting, the CAT modeling. Just سؤال يا أحمد لو تسمح، هل فيه مبادرة على مستوى السوق السعودي؟ لأنه أنا بعرف أنه التكلفة ستكون كبيرة على السعودي. هل على مستوى، وأنت بخبرتك وبكونك أنك كنت أحد المسؤولين التنفيذيين الكبار في السعودية، تفضل أستاذ أحمد.
كان في مبادرة من طرف سعودي قبل كم سنة فيما يخص تبني زي النموذج المضمون.
الصوت يا أحمد. ما بنسمع الصوت يا أحمد.
عفوا.
ما بسمعتك يا أحمد، لو فيك تعيد لو سمحت.
اوكي، واضح صوتي الحين؟
ممتاز.
اوكي. اوكي. فيما يخص الصندوق، كان في مبادرة من السعودية او فيما يخص بناء صندوق للكوارث الطبيعية. كانت هذا في بدايات قطاع التأمين. الآن في محادثات مع البنك المركزي فيما يخص أكثر من مبادرة، وإن شاء الله أن يكون موضوع إيجاد صندوق للكوارث الطبيعية من ضمن المبادرات. لكن حاليا لا يوجد يعني ما في تصور واضح وش التوجه، لكن ما حسب فهمنا ان الحكومه عندها يعني مشاريع فيما يخص 2030 ومن ضمنها كيف اداره المخاطر الطبيعيه. لكن الان الانيشيتيف او التصور مو واضح لنا، لكنه احنا سعودري نعتقد ان دورنا كقطاع شركات التامين وشركه اعاده التامين دور يعني جوهري في الموضوع، واننا نساهم في اداره المخاطر وبناء نماذج مخاطر يعني تقييم المخاطر ونضمن سلامه القطاع المالي لشركات التامين، وكيف هذا المخاطر تدار وكيف التنسيق من ناحيه اعاده التامين وكيف توزيع المخاطر. فالان ما في انيشيتيف يعني اعتمدت او لا، لكن نتمنى ان يكون شيء قريب الى النور. لكن احنا سعودري يعني از شركه يعني عندنا الرغبه اننا نكون يعني لنا دور كبير في الموضوع ان شاء الله.
شكرا احمد. Andre, the floor is yours. You can ask question, to the speakers.
Absolutely. So let me just, before I ask the questions, just say a big thank you again to all four guest speakers. I mean, 4 fantastic presentations, all showing the importance of this particular subject to all of us in the region. And again, RMS is very, very proud naturally to be linking up with many players in the region as we try to grow our footprint. It's a region that we care a lot about. So we do have some questions, and we have some prepared questions to the 4 guest speakers, and then we will have the audience as well come in with some questions towards the end of the webinar. So we started off with Robert, very high level, great presentation. You did give us a few different versions of a gray swan for the region. What systemic risk, Robert, would you be most concerned for the MENA region specifically, out of the different ones that you explained?
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I mean, I would prefer not to pick on one specific topic, because I think I think it's more important to try and identify classes of risk of this character. I mean, the facade fires, as we already mentioned, I mean, they are a very interesting instance of this kind of risk correlation, systemic risk correlation, with lots of implications for the value of buildings, for the liability of the owners, and for the insureds too. So I mean, and I mentioned this idea of looking at what is correlated. So for example, we mentioned the Beirut explosion. I mean, after the explosions at Tianjin in China a few years ago, it's important that anybody who is writing risk in the vicinity of a major port, you should explore the potential that an explosion can occur there, but because of the storage of dangerous chemicals. And actually, it's worth actually plotting the exposure you have within, say, 2 kilometers of a major port to try and identify the risk. So I apologize for not absolutely answering your question directly, but actually more thinking about the process and the phenomenon, and actually getting you to think, how is this an example of risk correlation which I should be concerned about?
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I think the answer was much better than the question, and the way that you articulated already for something as complex as that, what insurers and reinsurers can be doing in the region already now in terms of controlling port or near port accumulations is definitely a good learning for all of us. Maybe Laurent, yeah, please.
Just Andre, before Dr. Robert, how come that insurer and reinsurer were not able to predict the COVID-19? This is number 1. Now, how we will do, or how we should prepare for the coming pandemic, because this is something which is I think this is a central question, a major question. Please, yes. Dr. Robert.
Well, I mean, I think some insurers around the world would claim that they had thought about potential pandemics. So for the life and health industry, we have been modeling the risk from pandemics for the last 15 years. And the life and health industry, I think, from what has happened from COVID, it has not been a big surprise. They were modeling this risk. It has been a big surprise to people who are writing business interruption covers. I think in the US, for example, because they had more experience of SARS, back in 2005 and afterwards, they had written in clauses in their contracts avoiding coverage for a pandemic, but in Europe in particular, there had not been previous experience, and so the insurers did not write in that kind of coverage, and so I think that is the challenge, is really to make companies think through everything that has the potential to happen.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. Andre?
Yep. No, thank you, Shakib. So just going back to Laurent, Dr. Robert obviously gave some advice in terms of what we could be doing already around port accumulation. Laurent, I mean, you gave very good examples in terms of some of RMS's tools already that we're developing and that are also applicable as we speak for the MENA region. How do you see RMS helping some of the clients in the MENA region with regards to nat-cat underwriting or exposure controls?
So as we said, I think we have those basic tools, I would say, in terms of solution to manage exposure, accumulation, understand the different risks in a deterministic way. At this stage, that's something that we can deliver to the market as a first step, I think, in terms of the risk modeling. And I just want to echo as well the different speakers in terms of this engagement to have more informed risk management processes in place in the MENA region. So we are, I think this kind of event is also a way to get connected together and to understand how RMS could basically leverage what we have done in other territories in the MENA region. So just to give you a brief example, I think I would say 7-8 years ago, it was very difficult to create those very complex probabilistic flood models. And actually, we spent a lot of time doing that for Europe. It was a challenge. And then a few years after, we managed to do that for the whole of US, which is a 10 times bigger territory than the continental Europe. Now we learn in the past 7-8 years how to basically use this framework a bit on a global scale, right? So that's an example. We were in a very interesting turning point where we have developed a lot of technology that we can use to develop new full solutions for the market. And this wasn't just not possible maybe 7-8 years before there. So, I mean, I'm very happy, I mean, on the product side to be engaged with anyone who has an interest in exchanging on that and to see how we can help. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Laurent. And Shakib, you want to pose the questions to our two other friends on the panel?
Yes, please. Yes, please. I have a few questions, to Abdulrahim Shafi'i, my friend Abdulrahim Shafi'i. كم استغرق الوقت للبدء في العمل بمشروع الصندوق؟ لأنني بعرف أنك أنت اشتغلت عليه لفترة ليست بالقليلة. هذا سؤالي الأول. سؤالي الثاني، كيف يمكن لبقية البلدان العربية أن تستفيد من تجربة الصندوق المغربي؟ أو كيف لمداجة المخاطر الموديلينج أن تطبق في البلدان العربية الأخرى؟ أستاذ عبد الرحيم.
شكرا الأستاذ شكيب. السؤال الأول على الفهم، على ما فهمت، هو كم استغرق الوقت
نعم.
لإحداث أو لإنشاء صندوق التضامن. فقد تم تعييني من طرف جلالة الملك في 6 شهور قبل بدء العمل. إذن كان هناك اشتغال لمدة 6 شهور حتى يتمكن الصندوق من العمل، وكانت تجربة جيدة، لأنني كان هناك دعم كثير، دعم من وزارة المالية، دعم من هيئة المراقبة على التأمينات، دعم من شركات التأمين، دعم من منظمات كالبنك الدولي، دعم كذلك من بعض شركات إعادة التأمين العالمية، وبعد and some brokers. إذن كان هناك دعم كثير، لأن البرنامج كان يجب أن يفعل قريبا، لأن تاريخ 1 يناير 2020 كان تاريخ جد قريب، ولذلك فكانت هناك مجموعة من الفعاليات والشركات والمنظمات والناس الذين تعاملوا معنا حتى الحمد لله استطعنا الخروج بتغطية وحتى نكون في الموعد. أما بالنسبة للسؤال كيف يمكن لبقية البلدان أن تستفيد من تجربة نموذج الصندوق المغربي، فهذا السؤال جيد، ويمكن أن أقول بأن الأبواب مفتوحة لكل من يريد المزيد من المعلومات حول الصندوق، التضامن وتبادل الخبرات. وفي هذا الصدد، ورغم أن الصندوق بدأ العمل به انطلاقا من 1 يناير 2020، فقد شاركنا في ورشتين للتبادل من أجل تبادل الخبرة. ورش كان الأول كان مع دولة عربية، والثاني كان مع مجموعة من الدول جنوب إفريقيا، جنوب الصحراء، دول إفريقيا جنوب الصحراء. وكل هذه الدول تعمل من أجل بناء نظام تغطية ضد الكوارث للحد من التقلبات المناخية، بالخصوص في دول إفريقيا جنوب الصحراء هناك مشاكل التقلبات المناخية وكذلك تأثيرها على الفلاحة. إذا نبدأ أكثر بمشاكل فلاحية، ولكن هناك تجربة اللي أعطينا كيف قمنا وما هي المراحل التي قمنا بها من أجل بناء صندوق التضامن.
شكرا. سؤال أو سؤالين بالأحرى للأستاذ أحمد القريشي. مع التوسع العمراني والسكاني الذي تعرفه المملكة العربية السعودية، ماذا أهمية استخدام نماذج للكوارث الطبيعية والكوارث من صنع الإنسان، ومع الأخذ بعين الاعتبار المشاريع الكبيرة جدا؟ تفضلت أنت بالكلام عن مشروع نيوم، ومشروع نيوم يقع في منطقة أقل ما يقال عنها أنها منطقة زلازل. فأنا من قبل كنت بفكر بقول لماذا تم الاختيار على نيوم؟ لأن اليوم أنا إذا كنت مسؤول في الحكومة السعودية، سواء في وزارة الداخلية أو وزارة المالية، أو كنت مسؤول في السعودي ري، أو مسؤول في شركات التأمين اللي هي، أو مسؤول في شركة إعادة التأمين، أي ريسك بده يجيني من نيوم، وبالخصوص الانجينيرينج ريسك في المرحلة الأولى، بدي أتسأل. فإذا يمكن تعطينا فكرة على الموضوع ده. السؤال الثاني اللي كمان مهم، اليوم أنت لما بتشتغل كأكتواري، هل عندك بيانات تشتغل عليها؟ ماذا توفر البيانات في السعودية؟ لأن أنا بتذكر لما كنا بنشتغل على الفيضانات نتاع جدة من 2011 إذا ما خانت الذاكرة، أو 2012، كان ما عدا تعاونية لم تكن لنا بيانات، بس كانت عندنا بيانات بس على الكليمز. بس احنا أي شيء استباقي أو أي شيء يعطينا تراكمات صراحة ما كناش. لأن لما صار فيضان الكبير اللي كان صار من بحيرة مسك، صراحة كلنا تفاجأنا، أنا كأندرايتر تفاجأت، لم يكن في الحسبان أبدا. بعدين شفنا أنه تعاونية كان عندها كليم ستاتستكس فقط، بس ما كان عندنا شيء استباقي. ممكن تشرح لنا بالوضع في السعودية لو سمحت أستاذ أحمد؟
بالتأكيد. نعم، الآن الصواعب اللي تواجه المملكة في توسع كبير في ناحية التوسع العمراني في المدن الرئيسية زي الرياض وجدة، وأيضا في المشاريع السياحية ومن ضمنها نيوم. هذا يعني استوجب استثمار كبير جدا من ناحية الدولة، لأن هذا بالنهاية يأثر على اقتصاد الدولة يعني من أكثر من ناحية. الإشكالية الثانية اللي تواجه القطاع المالي الآن، هذا نراه انه شيء يعني مهم، يعني ضمان اقتصاد الدولة واقتصاد المال في المملكة. أيضا دور شركات التأمين لازم يكون لها دور أساسي وجوهري. لازم يكون في يعني زي مبادرات من قطاع التأمين، وممكن هذا كان يعني الدور السعودي يكون له جوهري في الموضوع، انه في بناء نماذج، ويكون في شراكات مع شركات الابحاث زي RMS فيما يخص كيف نبني نماذج تقييم المخاطر، لانه بالنهايه المخاطر هذه لازم يكون لها تقييم وتقدير، لانها تاثيرها الاقتصادي حيكون له يعني صعب، خاصه اليوم مع الارقام اللي ذكرت فيما يخص تكلفه المشاريع وتوجه الحكومه من ناحيه تصاميم المشروع يعني كيف هذا دور المشروع من ناحيه اقتصاديه للمملكه وحجم المشروع من ناحيه اقتصاديه او ماليه. فبناء نماذج تقييم مخاطر شيء جوهري، يعني في حاله عدم وجوده حيكون فيه صعوبه نوعا ما في تقييم المخاطر. الاشكاليه الثانيه حتواجه شركات التامين، كيف حتكون شركات التامين قادره على تقييم المخاطر؟ انا الوضع الحالي شركات التامين تعتمد على سوق اعاده التامين برا السعوديه في يعني في قياس المخاطر وفي مساله قبول المخاطر. لكن اذا القطاع المالي او قطاع شركات التامين حتاخذ او تقيم الريسك او تحتفظ جزء من الريسك هنا في المملكه، لازم يكون لهم دور في تقييم المخاطر واستخدام النماذج تقييم المخاطر او الكوارث الطبيعيه. فهذا يحتاج يعني جهد كبير في مساله يعني بناء النماذج. ان شاء الله يكون في توجه من الحكومه والقطاع المالي في بناء هذه النماذج. فيما يخص البيانات، نعم في بعض البيانات متوفره، لكن الان الاشكاليه البيانات المتوفره ممكن انها تحقق الهدف الحالي، لكن مع التوسع البيانات لازم يكون لها فيها نوع من يعني اكتمالها. الوضع الحالي احنا نستخدم بعض الطرق الاكتواريه في تقييم المخاطر، فناخذ الحوادث اللي صارت في الفتره الماضيه ونتوقع انها حتكون هي المستقبل، لكن مو شرط انه يكون المستقبل. يعني عندنا زي اليوم ما عندنا اي يعني مشاريع في السابقه او شيء على الارض الان، بالتالي من الصعب استخدام الحوادث السابقه في تنبؤ ما يكون في المستقبل. فهذه حتكون صعوبه جدا للقطاع المالي في تقييم المخاطر، وكيف حتكون ايضا كيف قطاع اعاده التامين خارج السعوديه حيقبل المخاطر هذه. فبالتالي شيء جوهري بنائها وشيء جوهري تقييمها وادارتها. فهذه انا اعتقد انها في المدى القريب ان شاء الله حتكون في توجه او ترنم بعض المبادرات حتكون لها دور في يعني تحدي الصعوبات اللي ممكن نواجهها. موضوع البيانات هذه ممكن اشكاليه يعني تحل مع الوقت اذا كان في نماذج وكان في توجه للقطاع المالي في بنائها هذه، لكن مساله البيانات ممكن يعني حلها اذا كان في اراده في مساله التطبيق. البناء او التوقع المستقبل بناء على الماضي هذا صعب، لانه صعب ان نتوقع حوادث طبيعيه بناء على بيانات 10 سنوات، اخذا في الاعتبار ان تصاميم المباني وتصاميم المدن تختلف من كل 5 سنوات. فصعب انه مثلا لما يكون فيضان يجي للرياض اقول زي اللي كان ب 2009 وزي 2011. فالتوسع هذا والتصاميم المباني لازم تاخذ في الاعتبار، وهذه من الصعب اني اعتبرها يعني بناء على بعض على قولتهم اف سيناريو كذا. فهذا تحدي ان شاء الله يكون في بعض المشاريع والتوجهات الحكوميه في يعني تحدي يعني تجاوز الصعوبات ان شاء الله.
شكرا لك استاذ احمد. عندنا 33 سؤال او 32 سؤال من الجمهور. بعتذر لانه ما فينا نردوا على كل الاسئله لان الاسئله كثيره واحنا كمان عندنا اسئله. فانا عندي سؤال اللي هو نايف كويشن، سؤال بسيط جدا. انا لما كنت اندرايتر كنا بنحكيه على الاي ام ال estimated maximum loss. فانا لورون اذا فيك تعطي definition قصيره. لورون if you can just define how do you calculate the EML. لأن I remember when we were talking about Istanbul or Algiers, we were taking something between 6 and 12%. The more conservative approach was 12. On what basis? Maybe you know this much better than me. Can you please answer this question?
Okay, thanks. Maybe I was not quick enough to switch in the translation. So you told me about how this is defined in a CAT model, or what kind of...
No, my question was, it's very simple.
Yeah.
As if you are an underwriter,
yes,
how you decide on the EML? You decide, let's say 6% or 12%. When I was underwriter, I was told Istanbul is 12%.
Yeah.
Algiers at that time, it was something between 6 and 12. And it was like a rule.
Yes.
Now it's a very naive question maybe for an underwriter, but I'm asking you this question because I'm sure that a lot of people want to know. It's
So yeah, so I can for sure provide like a modeling perspective how to do that and how this may differ by just by relying on estimates of this EML on your past experience, right? So if I may, maybe I can just share one quick slide on you for you there. That's sorry, I need to just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So it's not a MENA, right? It's just I just found that picture this morning because we presented an Italian event as well. So it's just showing a bit the difference you can experience from what you can get from a CAT model from the experience. So it's for the flood model we have in Italy. You recognize there is this kind of external probability curve when one point of that curve could be read as a return period loss. It's interesting to understand the difference between an empirical loss you can have for Italy versus one provided by a model, as we can build there. The model is given in blue by the blue curve, and you see the red crosses is the historical losses basically given by history. So we can represent the history by mapping all the events we had over the past 60 or 70 years in Italy. And you know, in Italy, one of the biggest probable maximum loss that experience is the flood in '66 in Florence. And the idea, of course, is the biggest loss we observed in 70 years. So, but what is exactly the return period, or basically the probability of exceedance of that kind of loss threshold is a big question, because we know our tail risk is very incomplete. So the fact that with the CAT model, we can simulate, let's say, 10,000 of flood activity in Italy, we get this kind of a more smooth and more robust tail of the risk. In this example, you see this return period for the flood in Florence, as it could happen today, is more about 150 years. So it does an impact basically on the person you are talking about, Shakib, right? The fact that the model can expand the view of risk you have there. It's valid, of course, for a return period loss. You can use to price a reinsurance treaty or to cede your risk. Of course, it influences as well on the long term, the average annual loss you can use as well. I mean, hope this answers your question a little bit, but that's basically how we should do if we have a model in a region. Yes.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Andre, the floor is yours to ask Dr. Robert.
Apologies, just getting off mute. Thank you very much, Laurent. As we're here now, an hour and 45 minutes into this very interesting webinar, I'm just happy to say that we still have 288 participants. So fantastic work, everybody. Yeah, so I do have a few more questions. And I guess in your presentation, Robert, you mentioned something, you know, even that surprised me with some of the knowledge I have, let's say, of the general nat-cat space. I would never imagine a place like Oman to be so exposed to a tsunami risk, for example. And some of those examples you gave in terms of the boulders moving from these prehistoric or these earlier events are quite, I think, they're quite catastrophic, absolutely. How can a company prepare for these things? I mean, you know, at what stage do you take your preparation going forward?
Well, I mean, as Laurent showed just now, we have a couple of ways of approaching this. I mean, one is to try and explore historical events if the evidence is there. Now, with a tsunami in Oman, we may know something about how high the waves must have reached along the north coast of Oman. We know, I mean, this particular class of catastrophe is very rare And I mentioned that it may have a 1,000-year return period, and if we looked at an exceedance probability curve for tsunami, there would be almost no loss. I mean, the tsunami, which happens once in every 50 years or once in every 100 years, has almost no loss. So it's almost worth, I mean, it's almost worth to take a deterministic perspective in this case, because this isn't like an exceedance probability curve with many different sizes of losses. It's got an extreme loss at a low probability. It is worth any insurer in Oman. It is worth applying a scenario, if you like, and a scenario event to consider an extreme tsunami and see what their exposure accumulation is, and actually maybe try and reduce that exposure going forward, in the knowledge that it's very unlikely to happen, but it is your job. I mean, if you are an insurer, it's your job to ensure you have got the capacity to withstand an extreme event. And we find countries like New Zealand now, for example, they are looking at their 1,000-year return period loss. They 5 years ago, 10 years ago, a company would be looking at their 50-year, 100-year loss. We're now finding countries that are looking at their 1,000-year loss, and and tsunami in particular, extreme tsunami is very rare along the coast of Japan. They should have been asking questions about the 1,000-year loss. We know Alexandria is a city which is very exposed to the 1,000-year loss tsunami in the Eastern Mediterranean. The north coast of Algeria may be exposed to a 1,000-year tsunami too. So it's something, it is not the first issue to look at, but it is worth considering the accumulation that lies within an event of this kind.
Thank you, very articulate, Robert. Thank you so much. Mr. Shakib, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. I have one question, which is really a very interesting question. Can we consider that the compulsory insurance, especially for the natural catastrophe, is something which can be considered as a human right? This is, I tried, to translate the question. Insurance protection versus catastrophe, is it part of the human right? I think, who wants to answer this question? I don't have the answer, to be honest with you.
I mean, I can attempt an answer. I mean, I think protection against disaster should be a human right. I mean, that so the first human right is that your government protects you. They do not let you live in dangerous buildings. They do not let you build in dangerous places. And if you like, there could be a human right about the level of protection. And then, I mean, based on that, clearly it's more complicated, I think, to claim that insurance is a human right. I think a level of protection is a human right more than insurance itself.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. One question for Ahmed. سؤال لأحمد بخصوص السعودية. هل هناك قانون ينظم قانون بالنسبة للإنشاءات وبالنسبة للبناءات يلزم بالبناء بأن تكون الأبنية مقاومة للزلازل؟ هل هناك قانون؟ وهل يمكن في دقيقة هذا كله تعطينا فكرة بسيطة عن البول أو المجمع اللي عملتوه في السعودية اللي هو نتاع الأخطار المخفية اللي بالفرنساوية بيتسمى la responsabilité civile décennale أو the decennial liability. ممكن لو في دقيقة لو سمحت. مايك بليز أحمد.
ما في قانون يجبر المواطنين او القطاع التجاري التامين ضد الزلازل فيما يخص الاي دي اي او التامين العيوب الخفيه. هذا قانون جديد تم الالزام او في مراحل تطبيق التامين اللي هو يغطي المباني ضد العيوب الخفيه من بداية تاريخ اكتمال المبنى إلى مدة 10 سنوات ضد أي عيوب خفية في المبنى. البرنامج في عده مراحل من التطبيق، فبدايته ينطبق على فئه معينه من انواع المباني، ثم يبدا التطبيق في مراحل مختلفه.
احمد لو تسمح احمد، هل هناك فيما يخص البناء هل في قانون يلزم بان تكون الابنيه مقاومه للزلازل؟ لان في معايير وفي اشياء معينه في البناء. اليوم في السعوديه لما بجي انا ببني بنايه من 5 طوابق، هل انا مجبر ببنائها وفق المعايير لمقاومه الزلازل؟
لا، في قوانين اللي هي تحكم اللي هي شو يسمونه شو يسمى بناء الكود حق الخاص في المباني. اذا كانت تضمن انا ما عندي خلفيه عنها، لكن القانون يعني بالتحديد انه يكون ضد الزلازل ما اعتقد في هذا. فيما يخص الاي دي اي، هذا تامين جديد يخص العيوب الخفيه. وزاره البلديات في السعوديه يعني عندها الزام ان تطبق على عده مراحل. حاليا تم اسناد التامين الى ملاذ كقائد للشركات، وكما يعني تم تعاون بين شركات التامين فيما يخص المنتج هذا. وحنا عاز السعودي كشركه اعاده التامين تم اعاده ممكن نسميه الصندوق، او هو حاليا ليس صندوق لكنه عن طريق شركه ملاذ سعودي اعاده تقدم اعاده تامين للمنتج هذا للقطاع. وعندنا اللي هي اتفاقيه يعني مدتها 5 سنوات للمشروع هذا حسب الاتفاقيه مع القطاع.
شكرا.
المشروع في بداياته يعني بدا في نهايه ديسمبر، وان شاء الله يكون في توسع يعني مع تطبيقه في السنوات القادمه ان شاء الله.
في اقل من دقيقه سؤال عبد الرحيم، كيف تمت هيكله استراتيجيه تمويل الكوارث الطبيعيه بصفتها احدى حلقات المنظومه الشامله للتصرف في الكوارث وتمويلها والحد من اثارها؟ انت يظهر لي جاوبت على هذا السؤال من قبل.
لا ماشي توتالمون، كنفكر كيف يمكنني الاجابه بالعربيه. فبالنسبه للهيكله كان هناك عندنا واحد المجموعه ديال الطرق اللي نقدرون التي يمكن ان نستعملها. من بين هذه الطرق هناك الموارد الخاصه ديال الصندوق، هناك comment on appelle ça la dette
الدين،
القروض او الدين exactement الدين او القروض. هناك شركات اعاده التامين، وهناك الكات بوند. هذه هي المسائل التي كانت متاحه. هناك دراسه، وهذه الدراسه اللي قمنا بها تعطينا ما هي الترتيبات المثلى ديال هاد أربعة الموارد حتى يكون عندنا التمويل الأقل بالنسبة لصندوق التضامن. إذن في هذه المسألة وصلنا أن the first layer، الطابق الأول هو الشريحة الأولى هي الموارد الخاصة ديال الصندوق. الشريحة الثانية اللي وصلنا لها وعدنا مثلا الشريحة الأولى تقريبا حتى 200 مليون درهم مغربي، إذن 20 مليون أورو باش نعطي هذا. الشريحة الثانية اللي تعطتنا الدراسة وهي القروض. هذه القروض تقريبا عندنا حتى تقريبا 80 مليون أورو. من بعد تقريبا انطلاقا من 100 مليون أورو تقريبا هنا وصلنا أن الأحسن بالنسبة للصندوق هي شركات إعادة التأمين، اكتتاب عقود ديال إعادة التأمين. ومن بعد هاد إعادة شركات إعادة التأمين مشينا للكات بوند. لحد الساعة عندنا 3 ديال الشرائح. شكرا. عندنا 3 ديال الشرائح وكنخدموا باش لتفعيل عما قريب الشريحة الرابعة.
شكرا. سؤال أخير لو تسمح لي. Andre, I have one question because I think this is an important question to Dr. Robert and Dr. Laurent. I learned that RMS is now incorporating the climate change in the risk modeling. Can you just explain about the climate change? Because the climate change now, we cannot ignore the climate change in the risk modeling now. And each and every, even if we do a basic, let's say, model, I suppose that now we have to incorporate the risk modeling. Dr. Robert or Dr. Laurent, it's up to you.
So I missed the start of your question, listening to the translation, but could you repeat it?
Yes, please. Now, RMS is incorporating the climate risk in the modeling.
Yep.
Okay. Now, how do you see the impact of this on the models, and of course, the impact of this for the insurance industry?
I mean, the answer is that it varies by peril a lot. So in some instances, like wildfire risk in certain parts of the world and flood risk, we are seeing increases in risk. And actually, we find our clients are interested in a perspective on risk beyond simply the next year. They are asking us questions: what is the risk going to be in 10 years' time or in 20 years' time? And so we find ourselves now needing to provide a perspective on risk over different time periods into the future, knowing that the answer will be different if we are asking questions about the risk in 30 years' time than if we're asking about the risk next year. So it has become, I think it's becoming an increasingly important topic. The regulators, the insurance regulators in Europe and now in the US are starting to ask questions about future risk, not simply about the risk for next year. So we find it's an expanding part of our role as in risk modeling is to provide these perspectives that include an understanding of how climate is likely to change in the future. As we do that, the uncertainty of our projections increases, but it's still important that companies are thinking ahead. They're not simply, as we've heard discussed about the events in Saudi Arabia, for example, you can't simply rely on the events in history. We have to be thinking forward about how that risk is likely to change going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Robert.
Perhaps allow me to add on behalf of RMS, for the interest of the participants in the webinar, climate change in itself obviously is not a model, but obviously has impact on several different perils that we face today. And for that reason, we as RMS are busy at the moment to provide a climate conditioning aspect into all of our models. And several of these models are being updated with the climate conditioning aspect of them. In fact, we have just released some of that this week. So for the interest of the participants, we will also make available additional information of how RMS models incorporate climate conditioning as a part of it. Perhaps, Laurent, you would like to comment briefly.
Just a very brief comment on the CAT modeling aspect, just to echo what Robert said. I think the very important element is that the CAT model itself is the perfect tool to actually translate all the great science that has been done into climate change, the change in the peril itself into an insurance losses, because that's the purpose of that tool. And one interesting features we are engaging with clients on climate change is how non-linear this relationship is. It means that a moderate change in the peril itself, like precipitation regime, could lead actually to a much larger change in the losses, because if you think the loss generation process is all non-linear, the vulnerability curve, you see the shape they are, right? They are non-linear, the defense performance, and even the policy, the way insurance policy are working is a non-linear process. And this non-linearity is a very interesting element, I think. And for the insurance, it's very relevant to see if a moderate change could basically make your loss explode in the near future.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Andre, now you have 1 minute for your closing remark, because we have exceeded the allocated time. Huh? And thank God, you know, we still have 244 attending the event. Huh?
No, absolutely, Shakib. So let me just quickly close off the event by a few thank yous. So the first one, a big thank you to you and the GAIF for taking on this initiative. You were the ones who brought RMS to the table. You're the ones who told us, please, we want better education around risk management, exposure accumulation controls, models in the MENA region. So thank you for being the ambassador, Mr. Shakib. Thank you very much to the RMS speakers. Of course, Laurent, Robert, a very busy person on BBC News and all other kinds of OECD meetings all the time. So thank you for making time for this particular region. Vivek, thank you, boss, for coming in and supporting the growth in this region as well. I cannot say better words. And of course, thank you so much, Ahmed and Mr. Shafai. Fantastic presentations. Ahmed, very, very happy to have Saudi Re as a client now. It's a real milestone in terms of how we build our footprint in the Middle East and the MENA region. And Mr. Shafai, I look forward to having you as a client someday soon, and we'll keep on working towards that angle. And I guess the very last and most important thank you is thank you to all of you, the 200, 300 plus participants that joined us for 2 hours of a very, very busy schedule. With a lot of virtual meetings already kind of overhanging us, to take some time to listen to us and our message. And I will close off with just one slide again that you did see from Laurent. Please do join us for our Exceedus event, which comes up in May. That's our flagship event that more or less clients globally attend, and this year it's for free. Please come and look at our website. We have an enormous amount of information there. RMS is not just a model company. We're a data, IP, model applications, underwriting company, and we are truly independent, which does give us a certain advantage in the market in terms of helping out our clients. And if any of you have any questions still, please feel free to reach out to me. You see my email there. We're here for you. We're here to grow the footprint in the MENA region. We're proud to already have some partners. So thank you. And to close off, Mr. Shakib, a Japanese bow for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andre. شكرا للجميع. شكرا للمتحدثين دكتور روبرت، دكتور لورنت، مستر فيفيك بجاج، الأستاذ عبد الرحيم الشافعي صديقي والعزيز، الأستاذ أحمد القريشي. فعلا احنا كنا كثير 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 مهتمين بكلامكم، وفعلا استفدنا اليوم، وبتصور لنا الاخوان الكل والاخوات الكل استفدوا، ونتمنى انه نتكلم مره ثانيه وتكون عندنا فرصنا ان نلتقي مره ثانيه. شكرا لارمس لانه هم السبونسور، هم اللي فعلا ساندوا هذه الفكره، وفعلا احنا كل الدعم اللي بنتلقاه من اي مؤسسه واي شيء بيروح لتربيه، للتاكيد على الاشياء الاساسيه. أنا حلمي في الوطن العربي، وحلمي بالنسبة للوطن العربي، هو أن يكون عندنا كات موديلينج في كل البلدان. حلمي أنه يكون عندنا معرفة حقيقية بالمخاطر التي تواجه المنطقة العربية. بتمنى أنه بشتغل عليها. بتمنى أنه كل الشركات، كل مراقبي التأمين، وكل معيدي التأمين سواء كانوا من المنطقة أو خارج المنطقة تضافروا الجهود نتاعهم. احنا في الاتحاد العربي مستعدين نتبنى أي مبادرة من أجل أن يكون لنا نماذج موديلز عن الكوارث الطبيعية، الكوارث من صنع الإنسان في المنطقة العربية. أشكركم جميعا، أشكر الحادثين المتحدثين، وأشكر كل الحاضرين، ولقاؤنا معكم سيتجدد قريبا. شكرا لكم، مع السلامة.
Bye.